Hello everyone, it's Albert, and this video is titled Acharya S and the Crucifixion of Horus. If any of you have seen the film Zeitgeist, you're probably aware that one of the parallels they claimed was that Horus had been crucified, just like Jesus, or something like, and that was one of the listed parallels. Well, as it turns out, there is no such mythology in Egypt of Horus being crucified. It just never happened. It doesn't exist. There was no mythology. Egyptians never believed Horus was crucified or any of that. So this presented a bit of a problem. Now, Acharya S, for those who are unfamiliar with her, is D.M. Murdoch, who wrote initially under the name Acharya S, is a Jesus mythicist who also tends to be in the sort of copycat thesis group of Jesus mythicists. And in her initial book, her first book, The Christ Conspiracy, she claimed Horus was crucified and continued to argue for that position, and in that capacity had actually assisted with the final cut version of the film Zeitgeist, the final cut version. She basically gave some advice on the final cut version, at least by her own account. And the problem is that by that point, especially as Zeitgeist brought this idea to a lot more people and people began investigating these ideas, it was found that it just never happened. There never was any mythology of Horus being crucified. And as her ideas came under closer scrutiny and found to be baseless, she had a bit of a problem on her hands. Now, it wasn't just that, but many of her claims began being debunked on the internet and videos on YouTube. And at some point, Murdoch began to respond to her critics. Some of these responses basically took the position that her critics had really misunderstood the meaning she intended for the term she used. In other words, when she said Horus was crucified, she did not necessarily mean Horus was crucified, or at least not in any use of the term that anyone would be familiar with. She did not mean, for example, he was necessarily hanging on a cross or some similar object. Now, one might allow for a certain bit of discretion in such definitions when making a parallel to Jesus. If Horus had been hung on something kind of like a cross, you certainly could argue that there was enough similarity for a parallel, even if the parallel were not significant. You certainly could say, well, that's a parallel, and then investigate whether it's an unusual parallel or not. However, even granting this wider latitude, there still is no such parallel between Jesus and Horus. So what exactly did Murdoch have in mind by crucified? In the recent source guide by Murdoch and Zeitgeist creator Peter Joseph, for which at least in the part 1 section was, I'm sure, primarily Murdoch's work, the term crucified was redefined to mean appears with arms outstretched in a symbolic context. Needless to say, this is not what anyone reading her earlier books would have understood, and this new definition was never mentioned prior to her claims undergoing the various debunkings. Now, under her new definition, any iconography depicting a figure with its arms extended is now considered crucified. The figure in question might be giving a blessing, casting a spell, doing a dance, flying through the sky in the form of a falcon, raising the roof, or even being executed on a Roman cross. According to Murdoch, these are all crucified and all the same. Thus, with this new definition, Murdoch can now claim she was right all along. Well, one might admire the creativity and the cleverness, not to mention the chutzpah, of whitewashing previous mistakes through such equivocation. This redefinition fails miserably on a number of points. All one needs to do to see this is consider the absurdity of putting forth a depiction of any deity of your choosing with its arms extended as a parallel to the crucifixion of Jesus. If that's what had been put forth at the beginning, no one would have even taken it seriously. Moreover, if she had really intended this to be the case, why did it take until after the severe criticism of her position to ever mention it? Just imagine the reaction if, instead of claiming Horus was crucified just like Jesus, the claim had been that Horus was depicted with his arms extended just like Jesus. The reaction would have been a collective, yeah, so what? It was precisely because the word crucified was used and the standard definition was implied that the claim had any importance at all. This new definition only creates the illusion of a parallel through generalization, and it lacks any real significance. The only remaining question, of course, is whether this really was what Murdoch meant all along. By reviewing Murdoch's earlier work, it is pretty clear that when she used the term crucified, she likely meant something akin to the crucifixion of Jesus. Whenever it was mentioned, it was always placed within a sequence that included death and resurrection. Think back to Zeitgeist. He crucified and therefore was died and was resurrected. It was always in that sequence of death and resurrection, and hence was associated with a fatality. Generally speaking, you do not die from outstretching your arms, unless, of course, something happens to them, such as they end up being nailed to a Roman cross. Now, in her own work, Murdoch, and this is in the Christ Conspiracy, Murdoch originally stated Horus was crucified between two thieves, buried for 3 days in a tomb, and resurrected. This certainly places the crucifixion in a death sequence with the two thieves added to the similarities to the scene at Calvary. None of that, of course, has any actual factual basis, and at no point in her early work did she give any indication that she thought crucified meant anything other than what we normally think of as a crucifixion. Even if she really was thinking of an iconic graphic depictions of Horus with his arms extended in 1999 when the Christ Conspiracy was published, that would only indicate that she was being deceptive. After all, if it were true, then Murdoch knew she created a parallel out of something most people would consider completely innocuous, and did so knowing her readers would misinterpret her meaning. It is far more likely, given her own prior claims, that she really believed there was stories of a crucified Horus in the normal sense, and she was caught off guard by discovering her sources for these claims were completely bogus, and she redefined the term to save face with her fanboys. In any case, it matters little, because given she only meant depicted with arms extended in a symbolic context, it is a totally unremarkable parallel, to be quite honest. One wonders now if she will argue that Richard Nixon was a pagan sun god, I am not a crook, because his iconic pose with his arms extended proves that he was crucified, and his political setbacks and comebacks perhaps were cycles of dying and rising. Well, on that note, in all things may to God be all the glory, and until next time, God bless.